Hey there guys, in this video we're going to be learning about the man who is probably most important in the emergence of the modern conservative movement and in the Republican Party as we know it today, or at least as we knew it until the 2016 election. And that man is Ronald Reagan. You can see him there along with his running mate, George H.W. Bush. They're pictured there in a button for the election of 1980, featuring their campaign slogan, "Let's make America great again." That might sound familiar to you. In this context, Reagan was using this as a way of distinguishing himself from Jimmy Carter and from the Democrats, who were in charge for the second half of the 1970s and led America through a number of crises, specifically the oil crisis and the Iran hostage crisis. Both of those were serious problems that Jimmy Carter did not seem capable of resolving. And Reagan wanted to show that he was a man who could change things and make America great again. So let's look at how he tried to do that. That's sometimes known as the Reagan Revolution because of the huge effect that he had on American politics. So here are some of the things that you should know by the end of the video. That vocab over there on the left side, you should write that down and write down definitions as we go. And the questions on the right, those are the three big things I really want you to know as you walk away from the video. So first of all, which groups did Reagan bring together in order to win the election of 1980? What is supply-side economics and what were its economic effects? And how did Reagan's approach to the Cold War change over the course of his presidency? All right, let's get started. So first of all, let's start with Reagan himself. Reagan had a number of nicknames. One was the Gipper, after a role that he once played in a Hollywood movie. And yes, he was a movie star. People knew who Reagan was before he became a politician. He played a number of leading parts in popular Hollywood films. Another one of Reagan's nicknames was the Great Communicator. And Reagan was a suave dude. He was calm under pressure, and he was really good at talking to normal American people and making them feel like he understood them and that he respected them. Something that Jimmy Carter was not very good at. And just to give you a sense of this dude's style, I want to show you this video clip here of Ronald Reagan telling jokes about the Soviet Union, making fun of their communist system of economic whatever.
I've been collecting stories that are told in the Soviet Union by their people among themselves, which reveal they've got a great sense of humor, but they've also got a pretty cynical attitude toward their system. And I told this one, Bill, you'll have to hear it again. I told it in the car. I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fellow, and this is their story that they tell, this joke, that this man, he laid down his money, and then the fellow that was in charge said to him, "Okay, come back in 10 years and get your car." And he said, "Morning or afternoon?" And the fellow behind the counter said, "Well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make?" And he said, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning."
What a charming dude. Anyway, that just gives you a sense of his style. He's got this kind of deep, gravelly, hypnotic voice, and he was incredibly popular among a number of very important groups in the United States. And it's probably for this reason more than anything else that he becomes the channel for which the conservative movement, all the different branches of the conservative movement unify behind this good-natured seeming suave old guy. There he is. saluting on the left. He was probably president at that point based on how old he is there. And there he is on the right in one of his movies, playing a brave sheriff. So people already had lots of positive associations with this guy because he had been portrayed as a hero in numerous movies. Now, enough about Reagan and his personality. Let's talk about the movement that put Reagan in power. And this is oftentimes just called the conservative movement. And conservatives are they're a diverse group. There are lots of different ways that you can be conservative. There are 4 different main groups that unify behind Reagan and unify under the label of conservative. And we're going to go through those real quick. So, first of all, and maybe the most powerful force in the conservative movement is called economic conservatism. Oh, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. All right, so economic conservatism is a force, is a political movement that believes that the United States government should play a very small role in controlling the U.S. economy. To put that another way, basically, people should be able to keep their money and spend their money however they want. The government should not tell people what to do with that money. It should not give money out to people, and it should not take money away from people in the form of taxes. This is sometimes called free market economics. The idea is that the government should not interfere. And this is pushing back against the economic policies put in place by FDR under the New Deal and by LBJ in the Great Society. Those were both programs where the government taxed people more and then spent that tax money on various economic pursuits. Welfare for the unemployed, assistance for the old in the form of Social Security, medical care for the old or for the poor, various public projects to stimulate the economy. Economic conservatives think that is a bad idea and that it's more efficient just to let people keep their money and spend their money however they want. The next big group is religious conservatives. Religious conservatives are upset about all of the cultural changes that have gone on since the 1950s. Religious conservatives believe in sort of a traditional family life. They think the family is the core unit of society. They believe that men and women should get married and have kids and live in a traditional sort of family. They think women should play a subordinate role to men very frequently. They're opposed to the feminist movement. They're also opposed to abortion. They're opposed to any sort of sexuality other than straightforward heterosexuality. So they're not comfortable with the growing number of openly homosexual people in the United States. All of these they see as a problem, as people getting more and more far away from the traditional Christian way of life. And they want to get back towards that. They want to make abortion illegal. They don't want to recognize homosexuals, that sort of thing. The third kind of conservative is the anti-communist conservative, sometimes also known as Cold War hawks. These guys believe that the U.S. should use its military might to beat the Soviet Union and end the Cold War victoriously. These guys believe that the United States should use its giant economy to build up its military and then use the giant military to force the Soviet Union out of the conflict. Of course, this conflicts a little bit with economic conservatism because in order to raise money for the military, you have to tax people. So there is that. So there is this tension here between military conservatives and economic conservatives. And last of all, there's anti-civil rights conservatives. And these guys, probably the ugliest corner of the conservative movement, are deep down motivated to stop the federal government from doing anything else to bring about racial equality in the South. So the federal government, since the time of LBJ, had been passing a number of different laws to make sure that black people in the South got equal representation. And they were still doing that. And one of the big fights in the 1970s had been over busing, whether or not neighborhoods had to bus kids to different schools to make sure that kids were going to racially integrated schools. So anyway, the anti-civil rights conservatives did not want the federal government to do anything else to bring about racial equality. And they called themselves states' rights conservatives. That is, they want the states to be able to decide for themselves. So Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana should get to decide for itself what laws we're going to have, or what laws we're going to go into place. The federal government should not decide for them. But at the core of this was the desire to stop the civil rights movement. Anyway, Reagan, that charismatic dude we just saw, was able to win the support of all of these different movements and to put together a very powerful coalition of different political perspectives and just crush Carter in the election of 1980, as you can see on the map there. Carter only won 6 states, one of which was his home state of Georgia. And Reagan, with this powerful coalition, was able to win basically the entire country's vote. So let's talk now about a couple of Reagan's major achievements. We're going to look at his foreign policy with the Soviet Union, but first we're going to look at his economic policy, often called supply-side economics. So you might remember that the big economic problem of the late 70s was something called stagflation. And stagflation is where you have high unemployment, but you also have a high rate of inflation. And this is a very problematic situation to be in, because normally you solve inflation by taking money out of the economy, and you solve unemployment by putting money into the economy. So in stagflation, you're stuck, because if you fix one problem, the other problem will get worse. You can put money in to help more people get to work, support more people, help them find jobs, but then inflation will go up. Or you can pull money out, but that means that more people are going to lose their jobs, and even though inflation will go down, more people will be unemployed. So it's a serious problem, and it demands a innovative response. And the response that Reagan decides to go with is called supply-side economics, which is a different way of dealing with the problem of stagflation. And so there are 2 components here. One is cutting taxes on the wealthy, and the other is reducing government regulations. By cutting taxes on the wealthy, Reagan believed that the money that the wealthy got to keep, that the government did not take away, would be invested in businesses. So if a rich person all of a sudden got like $100,000 back from the government, that rich person could then use that $100,000 to, I don't know, renovate their house or start a new business somewhere. And either way, that money would then flow down to the workers that the rich person paid. And so by giving more money to the wealthy people, this would then encourage the wealthy people to spend money and would lead to more money flowing around the economy and more jobs. That addresses unemployment. The second part, reducing government regulation, was designed to help with inflation. And the idea here was that ever since Teddy Roosevelt with the jungle and the meat regulation that we learned about way back in the first semester, there had been various rules put in place by the government to tell businesses what they were allowed to do. For example, you're not allowed to sell meat that has workers' ground up thumbs in it, or whatever. And the upside of that is that you're not eating people's thumbs, but the downside is it's more expensive for businesses to do that, and it drives prices up. And so if you want to bring prices down and fight inflation, as Reagan wanted to, you can cut these regulations. And those are the 2 pillars of supply-side economics. One is taxing less, and the other is cutting government regulations. That way there'll be more money flowing around, and the businesses will have to waste less time and less money complying with government regulations. And so how effective was this economic system? Well, I'll tell you right now that this is a incredibly politicized debate. It's almost impossible to find a straightforward discussion of this issue because depending on a person's political view, either Reagan was wildly successful or he was a blundering idiot that ruined America. So anyway, I'm going to try and give you a balanced perspective on the pros and cons of supply-side economics. So on the plus side, supply-side economics did help to deal with stagflation. Now, it's not 100% Reagan's credit that the stagflation came to an end. It also has to do with lowering oil prices, but reducing regulations and cutting taxes definitely does help to boost the economy and bring about a better economic situation, at least in the short term. Also, during the 1980s and afterwards, businesses in the stock market make huge amounts of money. So if you happen to own a business or own money in the stock market, you are in a great situation. Unfortunately, it's usually only the wealthiest Americans who benefit from this. And last of all, since the 1980s, with a serious hiccup in 2008 with the recession, the U.S. GDP has been growing at a very steady rate. So all of these are good things that can be partially attributed to Reagan's economic reforms. On the other hand, there have been some serious problems with this. One is that wages, that is the money that normal workers make in a week, have not gone up at all, or almost not at all, since 1980. If you look at American wages, and you can see there on that graph, the red line, in 1980, if they were at 100, today they would only be at about 105. So in 35 years, wages have gone up less than 5%. At the same time, the GDP, that is the total amount of stuff made in the United States, has gone up by almost 80%. So there's way more stuff being made, lots more money floating around, but it's not going into the workers' paychecks. So where is that money going? Critics of Reagan's economic policy argue that all this money is going into the pockets of the wealthy. And that seems to make sense based on what we know about supply-side economics. Also, another problem is as tax income was reduced and government spending was cut back, we see a massive rise in homelessness and incarceration rates. And some people argue that this was because the government is no longer providing basic services for the most needy people in society, and that this leaves people with very few options, forcing them either to live on the streets or to lives of crime in order to support themselves. All right, let's move on now from economic policy to foreign policy. So Reagan's 2 terms in office hold 2 very different approaches to the Soviet Union. In his first term, Reagan comes in, guns blazing, declaring that the United States is going to win the Cold War. And this is pushing back against the idea of détente put forward by Richard Nixon. Détente being the idea that the United States and Russia can live together in a sort of harmonious way. Reagan says that's impossible, and he calls the Soviet Union an evil empire, saying that it's the United States' moral responsibility to destroy the Soviet Union. And in order to do this, he launches a new arms race, investing in some of the most high-tech military technology ever developed. Nuclear submarines, stealth bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles that can launch like 7 warheads at once, and most ridiculously, the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars. And you can see a picture there, an artist's rendering of what Star Wars would have looked like. Star Wars never actually was implemented because it was impossible, but Reagan still thought it was a good idea and wanted to pursue it. And the idea here was that the United States would use its space program to put weapon satellites into orbit that could shoot down nuclear missiles, either with like a laser beam or a railgun or something crazy like that. Of course, this was way more advanced than the 1980s technology would have allowed, but the Soviet Union didn't necessarily know that. So even just talking about weapons satellites was enough to frighten the Soviet Union. And of course, the logic here was that by spending more money, this would force the Soviet Union to spend more money and maybe eventually bankrupt them. Maybe eventually they would just have to give up. But of course, the risk here is that this would make the Soviet Union feel threatened and could possibly lead to an increased chance of nuclear war. Maybe the Soviet Union gets desperate and tries to launch a nuclear strike or something like that. So anyway, that was Reagan's first term. His second term is quite different. In his second term, Russia has a new leader who is forward-looking and is willing to compromise and work with the United States. Before this guy, his name is Gorbachev, before this guy came into power, Russia was ruled by sort of like old-school dudes who had, been around during the Second World War and really believed in the Soviet system. Gorbachev realized that the Soviet system had to change, that the old-school communism that had worked for Stalin was not going to work in the 1990s. And so he wanted to reform Russia, and he wanted to make deals with the United States. And Reagan recognized that this was a guy he could work with, and he moderated his tone. He went from saying that he was going to destroy the Soviet Union to trying to come up with some way that he could work with and live with this guy. So anyway, they're able to come up with a couple of deals. They're able to come up with a couple treaties, the INF Treaty and the START Treaty, both of which reduce the number of nuclear weapons available. And they're able to make it much less likely that they're going to go to war with each other. Now that's a good thing. And this probably would have continued forward, but in the late 80s, a number of riots began to break out in the Soviet Union and its allied countries. And this is largely attributed to the fact that Gorbachev was much less iron-fisted than the old Soviet rulers. And when these riots broke out and they demanded democracy, Gorbachev said, "That's fine, go ahead. There are many roads to the ideal society. You guys, why don't you go ahead and pick your own government?" An older Soviet leader would have just sent in tanks and crushed the protesters, but Gorbachev decided to let it go. And what happened is a lot of the Soviet country, or the communist countries in the Warsaw Pact, ended up electing democratic governments and became capitalist. And so by the end of Reagan's presidency, the Soviet Union had lost almost all of its allies because they had become democratic capitalist nations. And to end the story, in 1991, Russian generals, unhappy with Gorbachev's performance, launch a coup and try to overthrow Gorbachev. This leads to widespread protests and ultimately leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union, leading to the rise of the Russian Federation, which is the country that we call Russia today. So anyway, that's Reagan's whole deal in the Cold War. A lot of people argue that, or say that Reagan won the Cold War. I think that's an overstatement, but it's clear that his military buildup and then his engagement with Gorbachev helped to bring the Cold War to an end. Last of all, we're going to look at a couple of scandals that Reagan got involved in his desire to project American influence around the world. One is called the Iran-Contra affair. And this was going on because in Nicaragua there was a communist government that had been put in place, and Reagan didn't like communism, obviously. And so he wanted to fund anti-communist rebels. However, there was not money to do this in the budget, and so in order to raise the money to do that, the United States began selling weapons to Iran and using the money from these weapons to fund anti-communist rebel groups in Nicaragua. All of this was illegal and had not been voted on or anything like that. And when people found out about this, a lot of people in Reagan's administration ended up losing their job. But not Reagan. He claimed he didn't know that this was going on, so he was allowed to stay in office. Second, during the final years of the Cold War, Russia was stuck in a very long conflict in the country of Afghanistan. And what happened is Russia was trying to support a communist ruler in Afghanistan, and a number of Islamic militant groups had gone to Afghanistan to fight back against Russia. Remember, communism is officially an atheist ideology. So the idea of an atheist ideology spreading into the Middle East really bothered a lot of ardently Muslim people in the Middle East, and they went to Afghanistan to fight Russia. And these people were called the Mujahideen. And the United States decided to give weapons and support to these Islamic fighters in order to fight back against Russia, supplying them with super high-tech weapons, including the Stinger missile, which you can see there, which was capable of firing a homing missile that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. This group, after defeating or forcing Russia out, went on to splinter apart and form the Taliban, which took over Afghanistan in the 1990s. And another group formed out of this was led by Osama bin Laden and was known as Al-Qaeda. And this was the group that went on to launch the 9/11 attacks against the United States in 2001. So that was an investment that definitely came back to bite the United States in the long run. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you on Ronald Reagan today. Very important guy. The main thing I want you to remember about him is his involvement with Russia in bringing about an end to the Cold War, and his implementation of supply-side economics, cutting taxes, cutting business regulation in order to bring about an end to stagflation, but also maybe skewing the odds to favor the wealthiest people in the United States as opposed to the average workers. Anyway, we'll talk more about this in class. See ya.